I've spent the better part of 2 months buried in logistics records that most military historians wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Canteen invoices, PX procurement manifests, Australian Defence Department pricing schedules from the 1960s, Senate subcommittee transcripts on military club fraud, the kind of paperwork that puts most people to sleep. But buried in those pages, I found something nobody talks about. A story about two allied armies, fighting the same war in the same jungle, who approached the simplest question imaginable. How much should a soldier pay for a cold beer? In ways so fundamentally different that it revealed everything about how each nation wages war. And when I finally understood why, I realized this wasn't a story about canteens at all. It was a story about what happens when you treat soldiers like consumers versus what happens when you treat them like citizens. Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province, July 1968. It's late afternoon, about 4:30, and the wet canteen has just opened. An Australian infantryman from 7 RAR, 3 weeks back from an operation in the Longhai Hills, still carrying that hollow look in his eyes, walks in, slaps down a few coins, and picks up 2 cans of Australian beer. The price is government fixed, same as it was last month, same as it'll be next month. Every can, every soldier, every day, the same price, set by bureaucrats in Canberra who probably couldn't find Phuoc Tuy on a map. 45 minutes south by road, at the American logistics hub in Vung, a different scene entirely. An American GI from the 199th Light Infantry Brigade walks into a PX the size of a department store. Stereo systems line one wall. Japanese cameras sit behind glass. Cartons of Marlboros are stacked to the ceiling. Prices fluctuate. Vendors compete for contracts worth millions. And somewhere in the back offices, men in civilian clothes are quietly making deals that will eventually trigger a United States Senate investigation. 2 allies, 2 canteens, 2 completely different philosophies of what a soldier deserves, and what that generosity costs. What I found when I started pulling on this thread changed everything I thought I understood about how wars are really fought. Not in the field, not in the command post, but in the place where a tired soldier goes to buy a cold drink and forget, for just a few minutes, where he is. When American advisors first encountered the Australian canteen system in Vietnam, most of them thought it was a joke. Here was the Australian Services Canteens Organization, ASCO, a government-run statutory body operating under the Defence Act of 1903, whose entire purpose was to sell cigarettes, confectionery, biscuits, soft drinks, and beer to soldiers at prices fixed by a ministerial board. No competition, no vendor contracts, no concessions, just a government agency selling goods at controlled prices, with profits going back into unit welfare funds. To American eyes, this looked like something out of the Soviet Union, not a fellow Western democracy. The USPX system, by contrast, was a commercial empire. By the time AAFES assumed operations of post-exchanges in Vietnam from the Navy in the mid-1960s, it was already one of the largest retail operations on Earth. During the war, AAFES operated more than 300 major retail facilities, 1,500 food outlets, and 2,500 concessions across Vietnam. They sold everything from chewing gum to hi-fi stereo equipment to Japanese cameras to Jim Beam bourbon. The system ran on vendor contracts, brand partnerships, and a self-sustaining revenue model that reinvested profits into morale, welfare, and recreation programs. The PX was America in miniature. One logistics officer told me in an interview I came across from the early 1990s. We brought the shopping mall to the jungle. And he wasn't exaggerating. The scale was staggering. You could walk into a PX in Long Bin or Cam Ranh Bay and buy a television set, a case of Coca-Cola, a tailored suit, and a reel-to-reel tape deck, all in the same afternoon. Meanwhile, the Australians at Nui Dat were running their canteen out of what amounted to a glorified shed. Their wet canteens sold beer, Australian beer, shipped in by sea aboard HMAS Sydney, the converted aircraft carrier the troops affectionately called the Vung ferry. Their dry canteens sold soap, writing paper, biscuits, and canned goods. The ASCO staff wore military shoulder titles. Prices were set months in advance and required ministerial approval to change. There was no haggling, no vendor competition, no supply chain of civilian contractors jockeying for contracts. Reading through the early logistics reports, I kept thinking, how could two allies, fighting side by side, have built systems this different? The answer, I would discover, goes back decades, and it reveals something fundamental about the national character of each country. The roots of the American PX system trace all the way back to the Civil War, and they're steeped in scandal from the very beginning. Before the PX existed, traveling merchants called Sutlers wandered between military camps, selling goods to soldiers at wildly inflated prices. The corruption was so rampant that in 1867, the War Department replaced the Sutlers with a formal post-trader system, which turned out to be just as corrupt, riddled with bribery and kickbacks. It wasn't until 1895 that the War Department issued General Orders No. 46, directing all post commanders to establish exchanges at their installations to supply troops at reasonable prices with articles of ordinary use. But reasonable is a relative term. The system was never centrally controlled in its early decades. Each exchange operated independently under its local commanding officer, and there was little uniformity. When the Army Exchange Service was finally created in 1941 to coordinate the thousands of PXS needed for World War II, the model was explicitly commercial, self-sustaining through sales, tax-exempt, and driven by revenue. By the time Vietnam came around, AF's was a retail juggernaut, and the commercial DNA of the system, the vendor contracts, the civilian workforce, the profit motive, came with it to Southeast Asia. The Australian system evolved along a completely different track. The Australian Imperial Forces Canteen Service was established in 1915, also under the Defence Act, but with a fundamentally different philosophy. Where the American system asked, how do we create a retail operation that sustains itself? The Australian system asked, how do we ensure that no soldier is exploited by the people who sell him things? This wasn't abstract philosophy. It grew out of real grievances. During World War I, Australian troops in Egypt had been gouged by local merchants and even by some of their own quartermasters. The backlash was fierce. Australia's egalitarian military culture, the digger ethos, the distrust of rank and privilege, demanded a system where a private paid the same price as a colonel, and nobody got rich off a soldier's pay packet. By 1959, the Australian Services Canteens Organisation, ASCO, was formalized as a statutory body governed by a board of management, including senior service officers and civilian businessmen, with operations audited by the Auditor General and reported to the Minister for Defense and the Minister for Finance. When ASCO deployed to Vietnam in 1966, it brought this entire apparatus with it. At Vung Tau and Nui Dat, ASCO operated both dry and wet canteens, selling goods shipped from Australia by sea. The beer was Australian, not American. The biscuits were Australian. Even the canned meat was Australian, because the troops found American food tastes, as one veteran put it to me, odd at the very least. Prices were fixed before the goods left Australian shores, and they did not fluctuate with the local black market rate. They could not fluctuate. The ministerial pricing framework wouldn't allow it. This was the system that American logistics officers looked at and dismissed as primitive. But what I found when I started digging into what happened next proved them spectacularly wrong. The first cracks in the American PX system didn't appear overnight. They had been building since the earliest days of the massive troop buildup in 1965. Here's what I found in the Senate investigation records. In September 1965, an American businessman named William J. Crum, a man the Senate would later describe as one of the most powerful, most corrupt, and most corrupting vendors in Vietnam, befriended 3 civilian AAFS officials and an Army lieutenant colonel in Saigon. Crum installed them in a villa, complete with a personal chef, a maid, and a monthly value of roughly $2,000 in free accommodation. He threw parties with large quantities of alcohol and available women. In return, one of his companies received an exclusive $1 million contract for jukeboxes and pinball machines across every PX in South Vietnam. That was just the beginning. Through a web of front companies, Crum eventually controlled the franchise for Carling Beer and Jim Beam Bourbon in South Vietnam. He sold frozen pizza and textiles to NCO clubs. He cultivated a relationship with Brigadier General Earl F. Cole, who oversaw personnel administration for the U.S. Army in Vietnam. A former Crum employee testified that Crum paid Cole $1,000 a month, and that Crum had told him flatly that no one is honest and everyone has their price, whether it was a 4-star general or a private. When the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations finally held hearings in 1969 and 1971, the picture that emerged was devastating. The PX system in Vietnam was not just a retail operation that had been corrupted at the edges. It was, in the words of the subcommittee, a system where fraud and corruption had penetrated the management of military club systems from top to bottom. Crum's Vietnam operations alone were valued at more than $40 million. And the broader picture was even worse. A separate study found that up to 40%, or roughly $1 billion, of all U.S. aid to South Vietnam had been lost to corruption. Now here's where the story gets personal. I spent weeks trying to find a comparable scandal in the Australian system. I checked the Australian War Memorial archives. I went through ASCO's financial reports. I read every parliamentary inquiry I could find from the period. And I found nothing. Not because the Australians were angels. They had their own problems, and I'll get to those. But the structure of the system, government-fixed prices, statutory oversight, ministerial accountability, simply didn't create the same opportunities for graft. There were no vendor contracts to manipulate. There were no civilian businessmen hosting parties in Saigon villas. There was a government agency selling government-purchased goods at government-set prices, with every dollar audited. The American PX's free market model, which its architects believed would deliver the best goods at the best prices through healthy competition, had instead delivered the greatest corruption scandal in the history of American military logistics. Meanwhile, at Nui Dat, the Australians were buying their beer at a fixed price per can and complaining about nothing more scandalous than the 2-can daily ration. And even that complaint tells you something. As Colonel Max Simkin, who commanded the Australian logistics base at Vung from 1969 to 1970, put it bluntly, the biggest problem from the man-management point of view in Vietnam was grog. The consequences of these two systems rippled far beyond the canteen walls. What I found when I mapped out the broader effects was a pattern that kept reinforcing itself, growing larger and more significant the longer the war went on. On the American side, the sheer scale and commercial nature of the PX created an economy within an economy. Soldiers were paid in military payment certificates, MPC, a scrip currency that was supposed to be usable only at PXS and other military facilities. But the Vietnamese black market quickly absorbed MPC into its ecosystem. Vietnamese civilians couldn't officially shop at PXS, but straw purchases through sympathetic GIS were rampant. An American soldier could buy a Japanese stereo system at the PX for a fraction of its civilian retail price, then sell it on the black market for a handsome profit. Every year or so, the military would conduct an unannounced recall of all MPC, exchanging old bills for a new issue. But Vietnamese civilians caught holding the old currency had no legitimate way to convert it, creating chaos and bitterness every time. The black market wasn't just an inconvenience. It was economically destructive. The gap between the official exchange rate and the black market rate for the Vietnamese piastre created a massive incentive for currency manipulation. American civilians, Vietnamese officials, and soldiers from multiple allied nations all participated. American dollars flowing through PX transactions ended up in Vietnamese politicians' Swiss bank accounts, and, in a bitter irony that still stuns me, some American currency from PX-related black market activity made its way to the Viet Cong, who used it to purchase medical supplies for their own war effort. The Australian system, by contrast, was almost hermetically sealed from the local economy. ASCO goods were shipped from Australia. Prices were fixed in Australian currency. The canteen operated on a closed-loop model where profits went directly back into unit welfare funds, not into a commercial system with vendor contracts and concession deals that could be exploited. Australian soldiers certainly interacted with the local economy. They bought souvenirs, they patronized bars in Vung, they were human beings. But the canteen system itself was not a vector for corruption. But here's the part of the story that fascinated me most. The two systems also produced dramatically different drug and alcohol outcomes. The Australian canteen kept beer cheap and available. The standard ration was officially 2 cans per day, though records show this was routinely exceeded. In the 6 months ending November 1969, Army canteens were supplied with 7.5 million cans of Australian beer. With approximately 7,500 troops in country at the time, that worked out to a daily average of 5 to 6 cans per soldier. The alcohol problems were real. Fights, vehicle accidents, accidental weapons discharges, all linked to drinking. Army doctors reported that alcohol abuse was implicated in up to a quarter of all psychiatric referrals. But Australian commanders, almost to a man, regarded beer as the lesser evil, and the numbers supported them. While a 1971 survey of U.S. servicemen leaving Vietnam found that 2/3 had experimented with marijuana, a third had tried heroin, and a fifth were addicted to drugs. Drug abuse among Australian troops remained rare. As co-author Ashley Eakins of the Australian War Memorial put it, a few Australian commanders said the Aussies had a drinking culture, and they were safer keeping that under control than allowing them access to what could have been far more damaging. The PX system, with its vast inventory and commercial reach, had inadvertently created an infrastructure that could be exploited for drug trafficking as well as retail fraud. The Australian system, with its narrow, government-controlled inventory, had no such vulnerability. A canteen that sells beer, biscuits, and writing paper doesn't generate the same criminal opportunities as a department store selling electronics, cameras, and luxury goods. By 1969 and 1970, the two systems had reached their ultimate expressions, and the contrast could not have been starker. The American PX network at its peak was a retail empire unlike anything previously attempted in a combat zone. More than 300 major facilities, thousands of food outlets and concessions, television sets, stereo equipment, cameras, tailored clothing, brand-name liquor, all available tax-free. The system was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue and supporting MWR programs across the entire U.S. military. On paper, it was the most successful military retail operation in history. But beneath the surface, the rot was deep. The Senate investigation that began in 1969 would eventually expose a system where generals accepted monthly bribes, where civilian contractors lived in villas provided by vendors seeking exclusive contracts, and where the line between legitimate commerce and organized crime had effectively dissolved. The free market model that was supposed to deliver efficiency and choice had instead delivered a corruption scandal that reached all the way from Saigon back to Washington. And then there were the soldiers themselves. Inside their tents at Nui Dat, Australians had chairs and furniture made from artillery boxes. And here's the part that made me laugh when I first read it. Normally expensive stereo equipment bought cheaply from the U.S. Army's American Post Exchange. The Australians were buying their luxuries from the American PX. They got the benefit of the free market without bearing the cost of the system that created it. Their own canteen gave them the basics: beer, smokes, biscuits, soap, at fair, fixed prices. For everything else, they walked down to the American PX and picked up a Japanese reel-to-reel for a fraction of what it would cost back in Sydney. It was, in its way, the most Australian solution imaginable. Let someone else build the department store. We'll keep our system simple, clean, and accountable, and pop round to yours when we want something fancy. The ASCO model was never going to scale to American proportions. It wasn't designed to. Australia had 7,500 troops in Vietnam at peak strength. The Americans had over 500,000. You cannot run a statutory government canteen for 500,000 people across dozens of major bases. The PX model was, in some ways, an inevitable consequence of American scale. But scale is not the same as wisdom. And the Australian system proved that a smaller, tighter, more controlled approach could deliver what soldiers actually needed: fairness, consistency, and a canteen that wasn't going to get their quartermaster indicted. In 1979, ASCO was formally replaced by the Army and Air Force Canteen Service, AAFCANS, which continues to operate today as a statutory Commonwealth entity, government-owned, not-for-profit, audited by the Auditor General, and still providing canteens, kiosks, and convenience outlets on 27 Australian Defence Force bases. The DNA of the system that served diggers at Nui Dat is still alive. The American PX system survived Vietnam too, but it was scarred by the experience. Reforms followed the Senate investigations. Controls were tightened. The commercial model endured because at American scale there was no realistic alternative. But the memory of what happened in Vietnam, the villas, the bribes, the billion-dollar black market, haunts the institution to this day. What researching this story taught me is something that goes far beyond canteens and pricing schedules. It taught me that the way a nation provisions its soldiers in wartime reveals what that nation truly believes about the relationship between the state and the individual. The Americans believed in choice, competition, and the power of the market. And they got abundance, corruption, and a Senate investigation. The Australians believed in fairness, control, and the obligation of the state to protect its soldiers from exploitation. And they got warm beer at a fixed price and a canteen system that never once made the front page for fraud. I think about that infantryman at Nui Dat, slapping his coins down for 2 cans of government-priced beer after 3 weeks in the bush. He didn't have a television to buy. He didn't have a Japanese camera. He had warm Australian beer at a price set by people who would never hear a shot fired. And you know what? I think he got the better deal.